What's up, y'all? Welcome back to another Fish the Moment live stream. Tonight, Randy, Block, and I are going to be breaking down fall jig fishing. Not just the basics, we're going to be going deep, talking about advanced techniques for fall jig fishing, where to fish the jigs, modifications, strategies to catch bigger fish, and also strategies for tournament anglers. Jigs are an awesome way to catch some really big fish. Let's give her a second here.
Sorry about that.
You're good, no problem. Technical difficulties are always part of the stream. It's all good. Randy, how's it going tonight? I don't really know where I was in my intro, so we'll just throw it over to you.
Doing good, man. Looking forward to tonight, Johnny. You know, the first Bassmaster tournament I ever won was on a jig in October, so I love fishing jigs in October. But, man, it's been a crazy week here. I just got my new boat and truck, got it wrapped today, got my Facebook page hacked this week, so I've just been got a little bit of everything going on all this week.
Oh, and so some ups and downs. It's probably nice to be in a truck with less than 400,000 miles. So it's even in that one truck for a long time. How's that going for you?
Oh man, the last one, I had it for 10 years, had 405,000 miles on it, and like I said, the radio hadn't worked for 5 or 6 years, so I got a radio now, and it's just feels like a different world. I'd still be driving it though. I mean, I didn't have any problem with it, but I figured, man, it's sort of running on borrowed time. That many miles on it.
So, Randy, I know you don't like live scope. What's your opinion on backup cameras on the truck? Do you think that that's too big of a game changer in the truck industry? Should we outlaw backup cameras?
The backup cameras are so great for putting your boat on the ball of the hitch, because then you can get right up on it, because before I just had to get in and out of the truck a half a dozen times every time I hooked the boat up. So that's always nice.
That's good. Good deal. I still am dealing with that with my old Tundra, but one day. Anyways, so one thing that I really want to talk about tonight, Randy, is how to target bigger or better than average fish in the fall. Fall can be a really tough time, especially for tournament anglers, if you have championships this time of year, or you're just trying to go out and catch bigger fish. And a jig is probably the best tool in any angler's arsenal to consistently catch big fish in the fall. So I want to really dive into that really deep with areas, techniques, everything like that. Before we get into that though, a couple things, we got to do some housekeeping. First up, want to announce the giveaway of last week's Bridgeford beef jerky giveaway. If you guys see down here are our title sponsors, Bridgeford Foods and the Bass Tank over in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Every single week we give away a free case of Bridgeford beef jerky. And last week we asked which lake was your favorite lake to fish in the fall. And the winner for last week's giveaway is Kai L. K-I-A and then a space and then L. So if you want to... if you could send us an email over at info@fishthemoment.com. Congratulations on winning this week's giveaway. That's Kai L. And he said that his favorite lake is Jordan Lake, North Carolina. Not a lot of bites, but you can catch some giants. And I actually fished falls and Jordan Lake over in that Raleigh area a couple years ago in September and October, and it was crazy, Randy. I caught more 4, 5, and 6 pound bass in October and the end of September than I ever have in my entire life. Those lakes are absolutely loaded with fish. I don't want to give out the secret too much, but if you guys just want to go hammer on them, those lakes are loaded in that Raleigh area. We had 3 fish over 9 pounds caught by the people who I was doing the on-the-water fishing lessons with, a bunch of 7 and 8 pounders, and then I think we caught 45 or 50 fish over 3 pounds in the course of a week's time I was there. So crazy lakes in that area.
Isn't that place that's the area where they caught those 40-pound bags, isn't it?
Yeah.
Those giant, 13 pounders or something.
Yeah, absolutely crazy. Those lakes are just full of fish. Really healthy lakes. Anyways, but yeah, so Kai L, send us an email, info@fishthemoment.com with your mailing address, and we'll get that free case of Bridgeford beef jerky shipped over to you. Huge shout out to Bridgeford for sponsoring the podcast. And then also, we're going to be talking a little bit more about the Bass Tank. So again, shout out to Bass Tank for sponsoring the podcast. We'll talk about them a little bit later. But for now, let's just jump straight into it, Randy. And I actually want to give you my inspiration for this topic, because I always like to base the information that we talk about on the stream in some sort of current events or something that's happening in fishing. And this past week, or this past weekend actually, there was a Bassmaster Open on Lake Norman over in the Carolinas. And Lake Norman is a pretty stingy lake in terms of quality of fish. There's a lot of 1.5 pound bass, a lot of 1 pound bass, and a lot of spotted bass. Not that many better than average fish. And if we actually go, let me scroll up here. I'm going to show you all the results real quick. Open this up. If we take a look at the results for 3 days, just give it a second here while it loads. 3-day waits here. Basically, the winner of the tournament, he had really good weight the first 2 days of the tournament. Of course, this is not going to load. Probably should load this earlier. But basically, he had like 14 pounds and 16 pounds. Oh, we needed the ad. That was why. He had 14 pounds and 16 pounds the first day of the tournament, Cody Hoyle. And then he had 3 fish for 9 pounds the last day. Still a 3-pound average, but really tough fishing overall. Second place was Jonny and Randy with basically 11 to 12 pounds a day, basically 12 pounds a day, almost exactly. And then just to make the top 10, Randy, all you had to have was basically like 20 pounds, 21 pounds of bass, and you're in the top 10. A lot of smaller spotted bass were in this lake, a lot of fish in that, again, 1.5 pound range. And because there were so many smaller fish, I think a lot of guys just got caught up in the middle of the pack, catching 7 to 9 pounds of fish throughout the day. A lot of guys were in the top 10 throwing baits, like little swim baits. Some guys were throwing jigs and topwaters. Some guys were throwing drop shots. There's a whole variety of baits. But one thing you'll see as a common theme among the guys who are catching better than average fish is a jig, another jig. So of the first 2 in the top 10, a jig. Right there, a jig for the 8th place finisher. So everyone in the top 10 so far is fishing a jig. Let's see if that trend continues. Yep, another jig here for 7th place, Josh Douglas. Again, they're filling out some of their limits and stuff, guys, with baits like a little swim bait or maybe a jerk bait. But to catch their better quality fish, they were going to a jig. We'll talk about how they were actually catching those fish. First angler here without the jig. He's throwing a big topwater, though. Again, another jig here, and you can see this continues. Basically, everyone in the top 10 that was really hammering them, catching better than average fish, were catching them on the jig. The only outlier was Jonny and Randy, who actually caught them finesse fishing with a Demiki rig. But the eventual winner, Cody Hoyle, he caught the majority of his fish, especially the last couple days, on a 1/2 ounce flipping jig around boat docks. So this is the reason I really wanted to talk about jigs today in this live stream, is that jigs are a great tool for putting that 1 or 2 extra quality bites in the boat, that 3 to 4 pound bass. Now, there's some lakes in the country, obviously, where they may have a lot of 3 and 4 pound bass, and so you can catch the average size of those fish is maybe going to be 3 pounds, so you want to put a 5 pounder in the boat. But whatever it is, that jig is usually going to help you put that better than average quality fish in the boat, whether that's a 3 pounder for your lake, a 5 pounder, a 7 pounder, whatever it is. And I kind of want to get into with you, Randy, why a jig, first off, is so good in the fall. Why does it produce so many big fish for tournament anglers and just recreational anglers?
Well, I think overall, the whole reason why a jig produces bigger fish in general is the bulk and the profile of it. Because if you take a plastic worm, creature bait, something like that, the profile on it is obviously a lot smaller. And the good thing about a jig is you can create different profiles. I mean, with the combination of your skirt, how many strands you have in your skirts, how much you trim or don't trim the skirt, the chunk or the trailer you have on it. And it's back to the old adage that, big baits produce big fish. And that's why a jig is such a productive lure. It's number one, it's a bigger profile. And number two, it's a slow bait. And anytime that you fish a slow bait, you have a lot better chance of catching a big fish. I mean, in order for a big fish to hit a moving bait, they have to be in just the right mood. The personality has to be just right. There's a lot of factors that come together for a big fish to hit a moving bait, but a bass will make a mistake a lot on a slow bait. That's why baits like Cincos and jigs and creature baits and Texas rig worms have stood the test of time since they've been out.
For sure. And obviously, guys, the title of the stream today is Advanced Jig Fishing, so I want to get into the advanced stuff, the juice, but we do have to make sure that we ground you in what we're talking about in terms of jigs in general. I think it's always good when we talk about baits to start with the baits we're actually throwing. So this is going to be a little bit more on the basic side to start out here, just to show you the baits we're throwing. But after that, we're going to get into areas, conditions, all that stuff. So, but let's start out, Randy, by just going through the different jigs that we throw. And maybe we just bounce off one after another. Maybe we can trade off. I'll start, and then you can talk about the jigs you like, and I'll talk about mine. So, first up, my go-to jig pretty much all the time, year-round, but especially in the fall, is a football jig. This is a Jewel Fish at the Moment offshore jig. It's a 5/8 ounce football jig with a Jewel bait Versacraw on the back. It's a Versacraw Junior. A 5/8 ounce football jig is one of the best fall baits you can throw, period. That's it. It works great offshore. You can fish it up in shallower water. And I'll pull up an image of the jig here in a second. Let me pull this up. This is the jig right here. And basically, the reason that the football jig is so effective in the fall is because it can imitate the two primary forages that you're going to be dealing with in the fall, which is going to be crawfish and shad. A lot of guys don't think about a football jig resembling a shad. However, with the Fish Moment offshore jig, as you can see here, I actually designed it so it has a very long skirt. And the reason I put this long skirt on there, you can obviously trim it up, but if you're dealing with bigger gizzard shad, 5 to 8 inch gizzard shad in the fall, you can leave that skirt full length. And even though you're dealing with like a peanut butter and jelly colored jig, those bass aren't going to differentiate that jig that much from a shad in terms of the profile, because the profile will be the same. The only thing that's different is the color. But because that jig is 5/8 ounce, it's usually going to be falling past their face pretty quick, imitating a dying shad. So that's one of the big keys that I find with my football jig fishing, and that's the reason I designed this jig with this really long skirt, is I actually trim my jig to match the size of the bait fish I'm going to be keying on. And I don't think a lot of people really think about that with jig fishing, especially offshore jig fishing. And so, for example, this is my table rock jig setup, where the skirt is basically just to the bottom bend of the hook. It's barely to the bottom bend of the hook, because on Table Rock Lake, most of the shad I'm going to be fishing around are going to be 3 to 4 inch threadfin shad, not as many gizzard shad. If I'm on Grand Lake in Oklahoma, though, I might go to the full-size skirt that's going to be all the way down basically where the tails of this jig are, and that full-size skirt's going to imitate that gizzard shad. So that's a really big key for me when I'm dealing with my football jigs. Another thing with a football jig that I really pay attention to is the weight, because a lot of guys will throw football jigs in that 5/8 ounce size, like my offshore jig, and just go with that all the time. And I would say that the 5/8 ounce size is really, really good in any other season other than the fall. It can still work in the fall really well, but for some reason when you get into that like September, October, November time, I actually have more success a lot of times on a heavier football jig. This isn't actually a 1 ounce football jig, and it's made by a local company called Bass X Jigs, and I just buy them at the local tackle shop and tie the skirts myself. But basically, instead of throwing the 5/8 ounce jig, I'm going to a 1 ounce jig. That faster fall will trigger a lot more reaction strikes from those bass, and it allows me to fish this bait really deep. A lot of the fish on these clear water lakes might be in 30 or 40 feet of water, and there were guys catching fish that deep on Lake Norman. And that 1 ounce jig is a great way to get some really good bites from spotted bass, largemouth, any real species of fish or bass that you're trying to fish for, even smallmouth. And the deal with that 1 ounce jig is it falls so fast by those fish that it's going to generate that reaction strike, even if it's around a bunch of shad. That 5/8 ounce jig might fall a little bit slow through those shad, and it may not trigger a reaction bite as well as that big 1 ounce jig. So when I'm going out in the fall, I normally have a 1 ounce football jig tied on and a 5/8 ounce. And I really throw the 5/8 ounce only if I'm fishing less than 15 feet of water. If I get deeper than 15 feet of water, I'm going to the 1 ounce size. So that's my first go-to bait there, Randy. What's yours?
Well, I've got 3 main jigs that I use probably 90% of the time. So I'm going to go through the first one I use here. And the first one is what I consider just a pitching and flipping jig. This is a lunker lure model. Actually, I'm working right now with Bait Works here in Springfield to design a pitching and flipping jig. So keep you guys updated on that. But basically what you have on a pitching and flipping jig that's a little bit different is, first of all, you got, you got a little bit thicker hook on there, and this hook is basically designed where it doesn't flex. It's designed where you can use a variety of different chunk trailers on it, and it's designed to be put in and around heavy cover with heavy line. That's the big key on that. Another factor on that is a turned eye on it. And one of the reasons I like the turned eye is it comes over cover a lot better. It comes through laydowns, bushes, that type of stuff better. And then you got a fairly stiff weed guard on it. We'll go into trailers later, but as far as on the jig goes, I use a combination both of the living rubber, live rubber, and the silicone based upon what I'm trying to accomplish. That's a whole nother seminar, a whole nother evening to discuss as far as colors of jigs, what works better for that. But as far as the size of the weight goes on it, a lot of it is pretty much in line with what Jonny talks about. I use anywhere between an 1/8 ounce to a full 1 ounce jig, and everything in between. So the jig sizes that I use are 1/8, a quarter, 3/8, half, 3/4, and 1 ounce. And the size, it depends as far as the weight goes on. There are a lot of different variables. It depends on the depth that I'm fishing. It depends on the water clarity, water temperature, the mood and the personality of the fish, how thick the cover is. A lot of different factors will determine that. And one of the tricky things about jig fishing is when you're talking about weight is you have to determine what is the best size to fish, because the rate of fall on a jig has so much to do with generating that strike from it. And not only the size of the head plays a role in there, but also the rate of fall on a pitching and flipping jig will be controlled by how many skirt layers you have in there, how long the skirt is, the type of trailer you have, whether you have a chunk style trailer or some type of a flapping leg trailer, and the diameter of the line you're using, whether you're using monofilament line, braided line, fluorocarbon. Every one of those factors is going to determine not only how fast that jig falls, but the angle of the descent on that jig. There's a lot of different variables coming in here. Jig fishing, in my opinion, guys, it's only second to jerkbait fishing as far as the amount of variables in the technique, because there's literally, in a pitching and flipping jig alone, you've got trailer, you got trailer color, you got skirt, you got the hook in there, you got whether it has a rattle or not, you got the hook head design, you got the eye tie on it, you got how many strands you have in the weed guard. And I'll give you one example here on the weed guard on a flipping jig. One of the big keys to hook and bass pitching and flipping on a jig is your weed guard on there. This one has been trimmed up, as you can see right here. I've trimmed it flat. I've removed about probably 7 or 8 pieces of the fiber on there. But a lot of times you may need to have the guard full fiber if it's really thick. Sometimes I'll take the guard completely off if I'm pitching around clean docks or something. A lot of things to consider on that, but and we'll get into the trailers a little bit more. But this pitching and flipping jig is my bread and butter. I mean, like I said, the first Bassmaster tournament I won was in October on a pitching and flipping jig, 1/2 ounce. And if you told me, okay, Randy, you can go out and you can catch fish however you want to do today, what would it be? I'd say pitching and flipping, a flipping jig in heavy covers got a rate up there, at the top for me.
Awesome. Yeah, and I think you made a really good point there, Randy, about customizing your jig, and that's so overlooked. And I got some sneaky stuff I'm going to be sharing about how I customize some finesse jigs, hand tying them, different skirts and stuff like that. As Randy talked about, he hand ties his jigs with different types of material, different amount of strands on the jig, trimming up his weed guard. The reason I actually designed my Fish the Moment offshore jig for Jewel is because I was really frustrated by the lack of customization on a normal football jig. And if you look at the football jig I designed, it has a double cable guard weed guard, which allows you to raise that weed guard up when you're fishing in brush, which makes it practically impossible to hang up in the brush. And then you can put the weed guard closer to the hook when you're fishing a rock, because you don't really necessarily need a weed guard. You just need the head to come through the rocks, and it'll increase your hookups. And then you have a longer skirt, so you can, again, adjust it to the size of the bait fish. I also designed it with a unique fall. So there's a lot of little details that go into jig fishing that I think a lot of guys are like, oh, a jig is a jig. That is not the case at all. The angle of the eye, the way that the head rotates on the axis when it's coming over rocks and cover. There's so many little factors that go into it. And Randy's going to be designing his flipping jig. I've already designed my football jig. And we do these things over years. I know, Randy, you started trying to design that jig almost a year ago, and it's not like this process where even though you know what you're doing with a jig, it's not like, oh, take this component, throw it together, and it works. You have to test it. You have to experiment, figure out the fall rates. How does it work with different trailers? Whenever we design a bait, Randy or I, we put a ton of thought and effort into that because you have to have the ability to customize it as needed.
Yeah, there's a lot of things on jigs as far as, let's just take, for example, the angle of the weed guard here. When you're coming out of the head here, if you don't get the angle of the weed guard coming out of the head at just the right direction, it's either not going to do a good enough job to protect and keep that thing weedless, or it's just going to get hung up a lot, or it's going to impede the action. So just the little tiny stuff about, weed guard position, balance of the jig, position of the rattle if you have one in there, the length of the shank on the jig. That's a big one for me. It's like if you're an eighth of an inch off on the shank of a jig hook, it can completely give it a different fall, and it's not going to work as good. So there's a fine line between having a really good jig and a not good jig.
For sure. And there's a question over here that was a really good one from Living Missouri Outdoors. Is it true most hang-ups on jigs come from the head and not from the weed guard? That is correct. Especially when you're fishing a football jig in rocks and brush and stuff like that. The head design is crucial in getting that bait to leverage itself over and around rocks. The jewel head design has been used for over 20 years. It's been perfected with there's actually, if you buy this Fish Salmon offshore jig or just a regular jewel football jig, the head is designed in a way that it has actual flat spots and dimples in the head that allow it to leverage itself in and out of rocks. And the reason that I designed this jig in particular is that it has the weight distributed further down the shank of the hook, which makes the head a little bit smaller, which also helps it come through cover a little bit better. The weed guard is really only there when you're around brush, when there's actual like trees and limbs, and that's why the wire guard is great for the offshore jig, because if you have that wire guard and you spread them apart and raise them up like they're kind of showing here in the picture, that will protect the hook point from the brush. But the head design also comes into play by causing that bait to leverage against the eye. There's a whole, there's this eye angle and everything along with that little dimple right there. The guys over at Jewel, they have like a literal graphic designers. We design these things spec perfect. It took over a year to design this jig to get it so that it comes over cover the right way. So much testing goes into these things. And some guys just say, oh, just take a jig, put it out there, throw it. But that's not what we like to do. I want to design a product, I know Randy does too, that actually improves the fishing experience, not just, something out there just to have our name on it. So the other thing that is really important, guys, know about jig fishing is that because you have to customize and stuff like that, it's not always convenient to buy the jigs stock out of the box. The one jig that I have, that offshore jig, is very customizable. It's designed for it to be customized, but another way you can actually get your jigs is by buying them in bulk. And the way that I always used to do this was actually just go to the Jewel Bait website. This is Jewel Bait. They've been the king of jig fishing for like the past 30 years. They're huge in their tradition with jigs and stuff. And you can actually go to the Jewel Bait website here, and I'll just actually navigate to it for you. If you go to Jewel Bait website, just jewelbait.com, and then go to shop, you can actually go to the bulk tackle. Go to bulk tackle here, and you can actually buy skirts and buy just the jig heads themselves. So for example, if you guys wanted to buy a bulk football jig head, you can buy these for $1.69 a piece. Most football jigs are going to run you $5, $6 in the package. You can buy this jig head, one jig head, for $1.69 and buy a bunch of them and then tie your own skirts. And you can also, my favorite lineup here, I really like this Special Ops series jig heads. Not only are they actually, they support the troops. Every time you buy one of these jig heads, it goes to a family who is served in military, but also they have some really good designs with nice heavy hooks. I love this ball head jig head, and this is actually the second jig I want to talk about, which is basically this round ball head with this wire guard. It's the 7/16 sound Tactical Pro Spider jig. And what I do is I buy these things in bulk like this. It has a nice sturdy hook, and then I tie my own skirt. And a finesse jig for me is my second go-to fall jig, especially when I'm trying to fish in shallower water around brush and like shallow laydowns. A lot of times when I fish offshore in the fall, I'm not necessarily fishing offshore in deep water. I'm fishing in 5 to 8 feet of water. And this is my number one go-to jig. It's kind of a special jig. I'll kind of show it and hold it up here. It's that 7/16 ounce tactical Spec Ops jig with the cable guard. And then I hand tie this living rubber, thick rubber onto it. It's actually like basically twice as thick as a regular strand of skirting material, and it's flat on the sides. This means it's going to catch a lot of extra water, and it also puffs out. And you can see the head is actually, the skirt's puffed out a lot. And the way I did that is actually wire tied that with copper wire. And I just basically threw the jig into a vise like you would tie a fly, and then I just wrapped the wire around the skirting material. I trimmed it up, and that is an absolutely dynamite jig. It's just this brown flatline rubber. I'll show you guys in Tackle Warehouse what I do. Basically, you buy these heads, and you can buy them again for $1.69. Then I go over here to Tackle Warehouse, and it's the Skirts Unlimited Flatline Rubber, the Tarantula series. It is this extra thick skirting material, and they're actually sold out because I thank goodness I bought some, Randy, right before they completely sold out. But November 30th is when you can get them again. This stuff is like really hard to keep in stock, but the black works really well as well. You don't need to just run with the dark brown. The dark brown is a really, really good color. That Fish Hunter green is a great color as well. I actually make some really good jigs out of the olive pumpkin and this pumpkin color. You can kind of mix those. The dark brown and the olive pumpkin, there's a good combinations. But basically that flatline rubber, it just gives a lot different profile to the jig. It's a little bit bigger, it's a little bit different fall, and I love it. And I'll just basically take this, I'll take this skirting material, and then you'll go here to Tackle Warehouse. It's just like in the lure customization tab, then go to the replacement skirts. And what you can buy is you can buy this tool. It's basically a Skirts Unlimited skirt making tool. Take this tool, you can put these little O-rings, these little rings on there, and you can buy those in addition. You basically just feed the skirting material into this tool. There's videos explaining how it works. And I basically make the skirts up first with that little band. Then I put that band onto the jig, and here's kind of what the skirt will look like after it's done. You'll have this little band on there like that. I put that onto the jig, then I wire tie it, and I cut off the little O-ring. That's just the way I do it, and it just makes it simple for me. And then I trim up the jig, and you're good to go. So that is really, I do that so often with my jigs, and I do that. I had to do that for years, Randy, with my football jigs until I designed this one that has the some living rubber in it, and it has that skirting material that I like for my football jig. We actually custom made this skirt for this jig, and so I don't have to make it anymore, which is super nice. But I still have to do it for my finesse jigs, and so I like that thicker rubber on the finesse jig because I'm fishing shallower and dirtier water, and I like a thinner living rubber for the football jig. But that is how I go about doing it, and it's super key, I feel like personally, to getting additional bites, especially in the fall when those fish are really pressured. Having a unique skirt, a unique look to your jig can be really, really critical. Would you agree with that, Randy?
Absolutely. I mean, just the attention to the details, what makes a difference on that jig fishing, it really does. And my second one is real similar to Johnny's, but mine is a finesse. The second one I'm going to talk about here, guys, is it's a finesse flipping jig. And this is just a homemade one, but if you guys are interested in looking at these, probably Jewel Bait Company has got the best selection of just a variety of finesse jigs, whether it be for flipping or just straight finesse. I buy them like everybody else does, so you can probably check that out here. Before I get into this one, I want to answer one quick question from Tyler here. Any advice for high school tournament fishermen looking to fish in college or professionally? I'll give you 3 pieces of advice. Number one, spend as much time as you can on YouTube watching fishing tournaments, just watching everything you can to absorb about technique. You can learn quicker and cut your learning curve down so quick by doing that. Number two, spend as much time on the water as you possibly can, because you can know a lot from watching YouTube, but you have to get real world experience. And number three is stay away from the girls. No girlfriends, because they're going to they will do you more harm than good if you're serious about tournament fishing at a young age. So that's my three pieces of advice if you're a young angler there.
Yeah,
Okay.
real quick on that, Randy, too. If you're going to do college fishing, I did college fishing for a year and a half at University of Arkansas. I was the vice president over there. I won a college regional championship, won Angler of the Year of the Arkansas club, all that stuff my freshman year. And I was gone from class so much. There's so many tournaments to fish. You have to go ahead of time to pre-fish, and you're traveling across the country. I quit college fishing because I wanted to get my education. It's very hard to get a solid education, have good grades, and fish at the same time. If you talk to Jordan Lee when he was in college, he was not fishing all that much or going to class all that much. He was fishing and then, kind of just getting by in school. So if you're going to college, maybe pick an easier major, maybe go to a college that is maybe more focused on fishing. But if you want to get a good degree and everything and fish college, it's very hard because you're going to be missing like half the semester going to tournaments. It's not the best way to get a good education. So just want to call that one out. And I decided my education was more important than driving around losing money in fishing tournaments. Randy, I won a college regional championship and lost $2,000 because of the travel expenses and the stuff.
Yeah.
So I won $3,000 and lost $2,000 because it's so expensive to stay in hotels and travel and do all that stuff. It's crazy.
Yeah, welcome to the world of tournament fishing. That's
exactly.
What it is.
It's ridiculous.
You got to love it, man. The thing about tournament fishing, if you don't love it, you got no business doing it because that love for the sport will allow you to endure all that stuff we're talking about. But okay, anyway, back to this finesse flipping jig here. This, even though this is a downsized version, you can see it next to the regular flipping jig here. When I'm using a finesse flipping jig, it's not because I'm changing how I fish as far as the cover in. I will take a finesse flipping jig and I'll flip it in willow trees and bushes, thick laydowns. With heavy line, I'm using this bait on 25 pound test line, even though it's a finesse jig. The difference in it is, like I said, it's got a real stiff, meaty hook on there that can handle putting it on a flipping stick and flipping it in a bush with 25 pound test line. Skirt is a lot of different combinations. I use silicone, I use live rubber, both. It just depends. One thing I do like in a finesse flipping jig is I like to put a little bit of tinsel in it. So you can see that there. Something about tinsel in this jig that seems like I get more bites. And this was just a practice jig. I don't tie my jigs like this with the collar. I like both of my sides to be equal length. So actually, when I tie them, this is going to be the same length as this, and I can trim it back. I'm just not a fan of the skirt looking like that for some reason. Weed guard's the same way. This is just a fiber weed guard, different varieties, trim it down to as needed with the cover. And the size variations on this, there's basically only two size of finesse flipping jig I use. Is the 7/16 and the 9/16. I don't really use much less than that because, like I said, I'm power fishing with this bait, even though it's a finesse presentation. I'm basically looking to key on those bass that are wanting those 3 and 3.5 inch crawdads rather than the 4 and 5 inch crawdads. So it's a matter of trying to generate the strike in the same type of heavy cover. I think one of the biggest mistakes a lot of people make with these finesse jigs like that is they don't fish them in heavy cover. Most people think about a finesse jig being around, bluffs, rocky banks, pitching them around boat docks and that type of stuff. But they are deadly, in any type of heavy cover situation. A lot of times what I'll do is I'll have both. I'll have the full size pitching and flipping jig and a finesse model. If I run through my key stretch and if I pick up 2 or 3 fish, I can make another pass down that same pass with the finesse downsized jig and catch some more fish. And obviously that requires a different trailer too, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. One of the things I will tell you real quick about the trailer on this is I don't like the flapping leg type trailers on a finesse jig. I prefer the more chunk styles. We'll get into that a little bit later. And also the skirt length on the finesse flipping jig is really critical because most of the time I trim this thing back really short. I'll trim it back, halfway back to the hook here. because one of the things I want on a finesse flipping jig is I want a lot of the trailer showing, because I think that's one of the things that, get you more bites, because a lot of times, it's more of a sight bite on these smaller baits. So that's one of the things I found out about that. So finesse flipping jig, ball head, turned eye again, stiff flipping hook definitely needs to be in your arsenal.
Good deal. That's great. And that's similar, that jig I showed you earlier, it's a finesse flipping jig. So like Randy's talking about, I throw this in brush piles. It's like my main thing around boat docks and things like that, but offshore cover. There's a bunch of people who are going off in the comments about the college fishing stuff. By the way, do want to shout out to the Hogs. Football team is actually good for once. The second I got into college, guys, there was a motorcycle crash. Don't want to talk about it. Ruined the Arkansas program, and I had 4 years of terrible college football. But now we're back in the top 10, so that's pretty awesome. And go Hogs. Anyways, that is a good deal. And then other people want to talk about want to maybe have us. Oh, one of my lights just went out. Want me to talk about why I don't fish tournaments. And one thing, I don't know if you guys are interested in this, but I mean, I'm a math nerd. I mean, I got my MBA, and I'm a business guy. I would love, Randy, I don't know if people would be interested in this, but actually do a cost breakdown of tournament fishing, the actual costs of fishing professionally, the amount of time investment, your ROI on your time, the amount of time you have to spend traveling for sponsors, how hard it is to get sponsors. We could do a whole analysis on it. I know all the information just from you and other anglers. We could put it together. I just have never put it together because I don't want to discourage everybody. But I don't know. I think that if people saw the actual numbers of how much it costs and how hard it is to get the sponsorship and what guys have to do to make it on the tour, I think it would be eye-opening. Would you guys want that? Would that be interesting? Randy, I don't know if do you think that's a good idea to even do? What do you think?
Oh yeah, I think it's a great idea. I think that it will motivate the people that really need to be out there, and it may save a lot of people some tremendous hardships if they're not motivated to be out there. But I'll say one thing about that is tournament fishing on the top levels now, on the tour type levels, is a lot different than it was when I started out 30 years ago. It's like, you have got to, unless you're loaded, unless you're just independently wealthy and just naturally gifted, you got to be willing to basically give up everything and just become completely dedicated and focused to attaining that goal, and scrimping and struggling and do whatever you have to do it, because it's not easy, man. It's not for everybody. It doesn't until you get out there and seen the real world of it. It's hard to really imagine what it's like. But at the same time, I'm not discouraging anybody. I don't want to ever cut down anybody's dream. But you've got to be hardcore, man. You got to be as hardcore as they come to make it.
Okay, well, Randy, people are saying that they want the breakdown. Hey, I got my Excel spreadsheets literally sitting in the background here. I love my Excel spreadsheets. So, Randy, maybe we'll throw that together for the next week's live stream. Do a full breakdown. I'll give you guys scenario analysis of, like, if you finish in the bottom third, middle half, top third in the tournaments, what it would take to break even in every tournament, sponsorship income. I'll throw it down. We can do scenario analysis, what if analysis. I'll put together some crazy spreadsheets for you guys, because I can already see it in my head, and if you guys are interested, I think that it could be pretty eye-opening, and also it'll explain, I think, to a lot of people why I am not fishing professionally, because for me, it is not a financially responsible decision, given I'm trying to grow a family and everything. It is basically gambling in a boat. And the numbers will show that. But, hopefully that will maybe open some eyes for people. Okay, cool. Good deal. People are saying, I'm not interested in going pro, but would like to hear the stats. Okay, well, we can do that. That's going to happen. We'll make that happen, Randy. Okay, so we kind of went off the rails there a little bit, but that's, that happens sometimes. Let's just kind of really quick, Randy, because we've been talking about baits. I said we weren't going to talk about baits the whole time, and we're still doing it. That's fine. It was good stuff. Let's talk about the trailers really quick, and then let's just jump into the areas of where to fish, because I think that'd be good. And I'll start with the
Yeah.
trailer that I throw. And honestly, guys, I throw one trailer nowadays. And again, it sounds like I'm just pitching stuff that I designed, because I did design a lot of jig stuff. But jig fishing is my number one favorite technique in the entire world. And if I was going to design anything for a product, I wanted it to be for jig fishing. And so the bait that the trailer that I use is the Jewel Bait VersaCraw, and this is basically a jig trailer. It's specifically designed as a jig trailer, and I designed this with Jewel Bait Company. And it's basically, I tried to make it a one trailer to fit everything. If you take a look at this trailer, basically there's a lot of different ways you can rig it. You can you can see that there's these inner appendages and then outer appendages. You can take out the inner appendages here, and you get kind of like a twin tail grub or like a regular flapping craw trailer. You can take out the outer tails here, and then it leaves the inner tails, and you get kind of this finesse craw style. You guys have probably seen this design in other baits. And then you can actually leave all of it on and just take out these inner gates, and you have a chunk style trailer, or you can just leave it all together like this and you get a beaver style bait. It really makes it versatile. Sometimes I'll even just take out this one little gate. There's so many ways you can rig this thing. It's absolutely crazy. I also sometimes just undo all the little tabs here and just leave it all flapping. That's one of my favorite ways to rig it. And right now, these are available on jewelbait.com or on jewelbait.com and also on Tackle Warehouse. They just added them to Tackle Warehouse. We only have the Pee-wee and the junior size. The Pee-wee size is tiny. It's for like little tiny micro jigs. And the junior size is good. It's what I have here on my football jigs, my finesse jigs I've been showing you. And there is a senior size that is designed. We just, with COVID, it's really hard. You guys probably know the supply chain issues and the labor shortages and stuff. If you guys are in business, you guys know that's a big issue right now. So we've had to delay the senior size just because of all of those constraints. But we are going to be producing a senior size, which is going to be bigger, which is kind of more of going to be good for like a flipping jig and stuff like that. But I basically want to design a trailer, guys, that's a one trailer to fit everything. You can get a chunk, you can get a finesse craw, you can get a flapping craw, all these different things in one trailer size. And this is specifically a jig trailer. So this is the only trailer I throw anymore. Really, my main two sizes I throw are the junior size and the senior size, which you guys don't have access to. But I have my own personal stash, and we'll be launching those as soon as we can get all the, once everything calms down in the world. But yeah, that's a trailer I go for. We produce it in 3 colors, guys, because I'm very basic with my color selection on my trailers. You got a green pumpkin when I'm fishing like a green pumpkin or a watermelon jig. Black and blue, I'm fishing a black and blue jig. And then I have this bass whacker color that it's like a watermelon candy, green pumpkin candy kind of color, which I really like when you're fishing for bass in really clear water, and also when there's a lot of bluegill in the area. So those are the 3 colors in the trailer, and that's pretty much it. That's what I do. I keep it simple, and that's my trailer.
Well, I keep it pretty complicated on my jig trailers, and you might be able to pull it up on. I don't have them with me, but maybe you can pull them up on Tackle Warehouse as I go through them, Johnny, and I'll describe. I got different trailers depending if I'm using the flipping and pitching jig or the finesse jig, and I'll sort of go over the ones I like. On the pitching and flipping jig, there's several different ones I like. The first one I like is the Zoom Big Salty Chunk. Now, the Big Salty Chunk is just like the old pork frog. It looks just like a pork frog. It's one of the oldest plastic trailers out there. And there's something about the profile of that Big Salty Chunk on a pitching and flipping jig that I just catch a lot of fish on it, and I catch a lot of good fish on it. It's a bait. It creates a really big profile because the trailer's pretty wide. It just comes in, real basic colors like green pumpkins, black and blues, and that type of stuff. But that's probably my favorite trailer to use on a pitching and flipping jig. Now, the other one I use by Zoom is called the Super Chunk and the Super Chunk Junior, which I'll talk about second. But the Super Chunk is the same type of sort of a deal as the Big Salty Chunk. It's a non-flapping leg trailer. It's got a different profile on it. It's got a lot longer, a lot thicker legs on it. And the Big Salty Chunk, you hook it on like a pork frog, just on the end of it. But on the Super Chunk, you have the option of threading it on the shank of the hook or hooking it off the end like a pork frog. And what this does it allows you to create two different profiles. It allows you to create a short, bulky bait if you thread it on the shank. And if you hook it on like a pork frog, the super chunk will allow you to create the longest jig profile that you can. So if I'm wanting to create like a massive size jig, I'll have this pitching and flipping jig with a full long skirt on it, and I'll hook that super chunk on like a frog to make it super long on there. Those are the ones. Those are my two favorites there. Now the other one I use with that is some type of a flapping trailer, like either the uh, Zoom, like uh, the super speeds crawl, yeah, the Zoom super speed crawl, or like a rage crawl trailer on there. Now this is a different type of a trailer. It's a flapping leg trailer, creates a lot of bulk, but the main thing about like the super speed crawl and the rage crawl is it slows your fall of your jig down tremendously. So if I'm wanting to really slow that bait down, but I still want to use a fairly large profile trailer, that's when I'll go to the flap and leg trailers. And also the flap and leg trailers, you can mix it up, and I can also use this as a swim jig too. I'll take the like a 3/8 ounce flipping jig, with the the flap and tail trailer, and I can actually use it as a flipping jig or a pitching jig at the same time. I know when Jason Christie won the Bassmaster Elite Series on Dardanelle, he was mixing the same jig up, pitching and flipping it and swimming it with this type of a trailer. So it's really versatile there. So that's the pitching and flipping. Now on the finesse jig, I have a couple different sizes, a couple different scenarios on that. The one that I like to use more than anything else is the Zoom Super Chunk Junior. This is a smaller version of the Super Chunk, and it's the sort of the same deal. You can thread it on there, make it a little short, compact bait, or you can hang it off the end and make a little bit longer one. It's just about half the size as the regular Super Chunk. And then if I'm using a true finesse jig, like we didn't have a chance to talk about this one, but a true finesse jig like this that has a small wire hook and is like 5/16 of an ounce, this is deadly with that Zoom little critter craw on there. Now the little critter craw, it looks just like a little crawdad on it. Johnny will pull it up in a second. It's got the crawdad pinchers on it. It's got the segmented body like a crawfish. It's got the little side legs on it. And that's a killer trailer when you're fishing like around boat docks or bluff banks and that type of stuff. That Zoom little critter crawl is really a good one for that. And the third one that I use on the finesse jig on the next one I use on the finesse flipping jig is the Zoom Z Craw Junior. Now, what I do is I take that Z Craw Junior and I cut it in half. It's got a rib body. It's got flapping legs, but the flapping legs on the Z Craw Junior do not pull water like the Speed Craw does. It doesn't. It's even though it has flapping legs, it's got very little water resistance. So I can still get the flapping leg trailer look. But it doesn't slow my jig down, because that's one of the things that you don't want. If you put a flapping leg trailer, like a true thick flapping leg trailer on a finesse jig, it slows the thing so far down that you can't even hardly fish it effectively. But what I do on that Z Craw Junior, guys, is you can take it and literally cut it in half. And I actually cut you can see the side legs, the little ribs things on the sides. I'll even cut those ribs off, thread it on the shank of the hook, and it makes a really good bait to use around dock. So those are the variations that I use. Those are, I mix them up between that. My color selection is really basic on there. I use basically 3 different colors. I use a green pumpkin. I use a black, just like a black neon, and I'll use a sapphire blue. And the green pumpkin is the one that I use a lot anytime the water visibility is over 2 feet. The thing that I do in my green pumpkin trailer to give me more of a variation is I use dyes heavily on a green pumpkin trailer. I use blue dyes, I use orange dyes, I use chartreuse, I use red. You can really make the trailer look a lot different on a green pumpkin color, just with dyes. So anyway, that's just sort of the foundation. I've got some other stuff I do with it, but that'll give you sort of a general idea to start with there.
And this is why Randy needs a 21-foot bass boat, because a third of his storage is just jig trailers. I have an 18-foot boat, so my VersaCrawl works out great because I need like 4 packages of trailers. That's all I have room for. And now I have like 2 black boxes in my boat from the bass tank because I have active target and live scope hooked in, so I can switch them in and out. So I have no room in my boat. One of my back storage compartments has a battery, and the lithium battery in the back. And my 18-foot boat has no storage. I basically have like my rod compartment and like 3 bags of trailers. That's all I fish with. That's all I got room for.
Hey, back in the day when I started out, we did not have dry storage in the boats when I started out. You had a rod box. Everybody else, you had those big giant tackle boxes. You sat on the floor of the boat. That was it, So
that's awesome.
That didn't seem like that long ago.
That's funny. Good deal. So a couple other things, guys. Here we want to get into like the juice. I feel like this was good juice. This was good stuff with the baits. I always think that the juice is like where to fish. So we're going to talk about a little bit where to fish, where to throw these jigs to get bigger bites in the fall. Before we do that, got to take a quick little break for our sponsors. First up, I want to again announce the winner for our Bridgeford beef jerky giveaway. Every week we give away a case of Bridgeford beef jerky, 12 packs of beef jerky. 2 of you are on the live stream. And last week the winner was Kai L. And he picked his favorite lake as Jordan Lake, North Carolina. It's one of my favorite lakes as well in the fall. So congratulations to Kai L, K-I-A, and then space L. Just send us an email over at info@fishthemoment.com and we will send that over to you. For this week's giveaway, what I want you guys to do is go down in the comments of this video after it posts live. So actually go to the actual video and make a comment. The guys who comment here in the live stream, we lose those comments, so I can't go back and find those. You actually have to go into the comments of the actual video afterwards and just leave a comment letting us know what your favorite jig is, your brand, and the color of your favorite jig for fall bass fishing. Or if you don't like fishing jigs at all, just let us know, I hate fishing jigs, I never catch fish on jigs. That's also interesting for us to know as well. So just let us know what your favorite jig is in the comments, and you'll be entered to win a free case of Bridgeford beef jerky, 12 packages right there. Also want to give a huge shout out to our other main sponsor, the Bass Tank in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The Bass Tank is the premier electronics installation company in the country. Basically, they do everything from installing bass electronics, crappie, anything you need for any species. They're the only company I trust to put the electronics on my boat. I graph like 5 to 6 hours every single fishing day, and I want to make sure that my graphs are installed properly, the wiring is in there correctly, transducer angles are correct, I have a good power source going in, none of my cords and everything are tangled and twisted, which mess up the image. I've had horror stories happen to me with my electronics where stuff was broken and I didn't know about it for like a year and my image was terrible. And I thought it was the fish finder when it was actually the installation. So definitely head over to the Bass Tank if you want to pick up a new fish finder and want it installed properly. If you're going to go in here, guys, and buy a fish finder, we'll just go to whatever fish finder from Humminbird or whatever. If you're going to go drop $1,000 on or $2,000 on a Helix 12, you might as well have it installed properly so that it actually works. You're getting all of the functionality out of it. And you can put $2,000 into a fish finder, and if it is installed improperly, it's no better than a $5 pole that you can stick down to gauge the depth of the water because you're not going to get a good image. So definitely head over to thebasstank.com and give them a call if you want to have your graphs installed. A lot of guys I know come across the country to get their graphs installed by these guys, and they are legit. They just put like 12 different graphs on my boat, Randy, where I can interchange them in and out. I only run like 3 graphs at a time, but they wired it so I can switch them in and out for testing different price points, units, and stuff like that. It was a nightmare of cables, and they were able to fit all those cables, all that stuff, into an 18-foot Triton from like 2005, where those electronics were not ever designed to go on that old of a boat. So they do a great job, and they're top-notch there. One last thing is I do want to let you guys know also about some things we have going on over at fishthemoment.com. Just recently, if you go to our website, fishthemoment.com, and go to the lake breakdowns page, I just added some offshore lake breakdowns. We have shallow water lake breakdowns from Randy, offshore lake breakdowns from myself. You can get 30 GPS waypoints that go straight onto your fish finder with detailed area descriptions, understanding of basically how and why you should fish these areas, and how to download them straight to the Fish Finder. I did 5 lake breakdowns this week for the fall. I don't have nearly as many as Randy. With videos and stuff, I don't have as much time, but I'm trying to get at least 10 out on the top lakes that you guys are interested in. And so check those out if you want some offshore waypoints on your home lake. Okay, enough of all that, Randy. Let's jump into my favorite part of this topic, which is how to find areas to fish these jigs to catch big bass. And one thing I do want to call Tyler over here in the comments asking a lot of questions about high school fishing, if you should fish tournaments, stuff like that. And I did a lot of tournaments, Tyler, when I was younger. By the time I was 20 years old, I'd fished 163 bass tournaments, if you can believe that, Randy. So I'd fished an absolute pile of bass tournaments almost every single weekend, Tuesday nighters, everything I could fish. And that really helped me become a lot better fisherman because I had tournament level experience. I got my butt kicked in most of those tournaments, but I talked to Rick Clunn the other day, one of the greatest bass fishermen of all time, and he always says that he has fished over 500 tour level tournaments, Bassmaster, FLW, stuff like that, and he's won like 19 of those tournaments, or 17 or 19 tournaments. So overall, he's won like 3% of his tournaments. So you're not going to win every tournament, you're going to lose most tournaments, but you're going to learn something from them. So one thing I can definitely say is if you have the means and you really want to do it, fish every single tournament you can, every jackpot, every $30 club tournament. If you can't fish the expensive BFLs and stuff, don't worry about it. Just go fish any tournament. If it's 12 boats of old guys who barely can stand up on the front deck of the boat, no offense to anyone, but there's you know tournaments. They're sitting on the front deck doing the bill dance. Go fish those tournaments. Figure it out, and you can catch them. I don't want to offend anybody. That was a little bit harsh, but anyways, that's what I used to do. Just fish everything I can. Anyways. So Mike is saying he's got the frowny face. Anyways, okay, so let's jump into where to fish for some of these fish with a jig. Let me pull up Navionics here, and I'm just going to start us off here with where I fish my football jig. Football jigs, again, are my number one go-to offshore or jig in the fall. I fish offshore mainly all the time, but my number one go-to jig, it's either a 5/8 ounce fish ball with offshore jig or the 1 ounce heavier football jig. And what I'm looking for in the fall, guys, is very specific with my jig fishing. And a lot of guys don't fish these areas, and that's why I can really catch them really well. And I'll show you a bunch of examples on several different types of lakes. But really what you're going to find is when you go into any lake in the fall, I'm just going to pull up Grand Lake here. We'll give a few more examples. This isn't the only lake I'm going to show. But basically, most of the lakes that I'm going to be fishing are going to be areas where you have some sort of creek channel that's running through the center of the lake, like this, with a football jig. I'll show you where I fish on lowland reservoirs or maybe lakes that don't have this defined creek channel, these like kind of highland lakes. I don't really throw football jig that much on like the shallow muddy lakes. I fish different jigs I'll show you. But when I'm fishing these highland lakes or lowland lakes that still have defined creek channels, the key places I'm looking for in the fall for my better than average fish are one of two things. The first is I want to try to find the steepest, sharpest drop off right on the main lake. And this is usually going to be good through the early to mid-fall. Right where that main creek channel is, where you can find where it's like 80, 90 feet of water out here in the center, and then it comes up sharply to like, let's say, 8 to 20 foot of water. These type of areas are not going to hold that many fish in the late fall, or early to mid-fall, but they're going to hold your really big fish. These are where you're going to have your 3.5 to 6 pound bass on like a Grand Lake. You may only get 4 or 5 bites a day if you're lucky, but you're going to get some really big ones. Usually these fish are going to be around brush piles or some bigger rock piles, and you want to find the sharpest, steepest drop you can from like 8 foot down to like 80 foot of water. Really, really sharp drops. That's the first place I look for, and that's pretty obvious. The second place I look for, though, is a lot less obvious, and these are the areas where I do most of my damage, guys. What I do is I go back into a creek like this, and what I'm looking for specifically are areas where you have bump outs from the shoreline. What do I mean by a bump out? What I mean by that, and this is like super juice, so pay attention here. Basically, what I'm looking for is as you move into these creeks, a lot of times you're going to have these flats. This flat right here, for example. And the contour lines are pretty uniform. You can see they're very tight together. And all of a sudden they start to spread out a little bit, and you get a super subtle point that sticks off the bank. I mean, this is super subtle. It goes from really tight contour lines to a little bit more spread apart, then they get tighter together again. This little bump out, this little hidden point, usually is going to indicate that there's a little bit of harder bottom in that area. You're not going to have a sharp drop off, but you're going to have a little bit of a bottom composition change from like maybe pea gravel to a little bit thicker rock. What happens is these bass are going to start transitioning from the main lake back into these creeks and set up on these really inobvious areas for just a short period of time, 4 or 5 days, nothing crazy. And if you can pull up on these areas when the bass are setting up there, you can hammer them on a football jig, catching 7, 8, 9 fish off of one spot. And they're really tricky to find. They're not obvious, but as we go back into this creek, you can see there are several of them to kind of take a look at. Further back in this creek, if we come in here, you can see we have another one of these areas right in here and also right in here where you have tight contour lines, really sharp drop-offs on both sides, and then it comes to a little subtle point that sticks out right here or that sticks out right here. They're gradual sloping points. They're just a little bit higher off the bottom. That's what I'm looking for. I'm not looking for these super sharp drop-offs, these really hard edges. That's what I used to look for a lot in the fall, and I did not catch very many fish as a result. But once I started kind of looking for more of these subtle little areas that stick out from the bank, I started getting a lot more bites. Let me go to a different lake to give you guys another example. A lake maybe it's a little bit shallower, dirtier. We'll go here to, let me think, Lake de Grey. Lake de Grey, this area of Lake de Grey is a lot more stained, especially up in this area. So we'll look at this creek here. A lot more stained, doesn't have that much water clarity, let's say 1.5 to 2 foot of water visibility. So as we move into this area, and you start moving into some of these creeks back in here, the areas I'm looking for are, example, like this right here. You can see you have a little contour lines, they're tight together, and then they start to spread apart and form this little tiny subtle point right there. And then they kind of continue off. This little spot right here, I've hammered them before on Lake de Grey, and it's just like this nothing looking spot. A lot of guys will be over here on these main points and things, and these will hold fish as well, but they get covered up by other fishermen, other tournament anglers. But these subtle little tiny nothing looking points right here, there's another one right here, another one kind of right here. These subtle nothing looking points, these are the areas that are absolutely dynamite. Some of them are more obvious. I know if we come back in here, I know there's a couple that are going to stand out a little bit more. For example, as you come back in here, you can see there's these points like here and here, here. There's some of them that become a little more obvious because they have a little bit sharper drop and they're a little bit flatter on top. But the more subtle, the better. The ones like this that are very, very inobvious, that are just kind of barely there, are usually going to be a lot better than these obvious points that stick off the contour map, just because a lot of guys are going to be fishing those. And whenever you get a gradual, like subtle point like that, it's going to indicate a bottom composition change, and that's really the key that you're going for. So that's my go-to kind of football jig areas, Randy, and that's like the juice right there. That's the stuff that I don't really talk about too much, and it helps catch a lot of big fish for me.
Yeah, that's the difference between like your style of fishing, Jonny, and mine with jigs, is the fact that a lot of yours is area related and mine is more object related. So I'll talk about that a little bit. Real quick, I want to address a question. I've had several people ask about swim jigs. And guys, I don't, even though a swim jig is a jig, I don't consider a swim jig a jig. I consider the way you fish a swim jig is more like a spinnerbait or a crankbait or something. It's not fished like the way that Jonny and I are talking about jigs. So when you're talking about swim jigs, I don't really put them in a category as a jig per se. So I know you may not have heard that before, but that's just sort of my thoughts on it. But anyway, as far as what I'm looking for areas on these jigs, and it's totally dependent upon the type of lake that I'm fishing. Just like I said, Jonny is looking for specific spots as far as specific pieces of structure to throw it on, the way the lake falls off, the topography of it. I'm looking for objects. For me, it's like it depends on like where you're at. If you're fishing a grass lake, you know, I'm looking for some type of a hard edge, some type of an edge to pitch and flip, you know, in the openings. Now those openings could be matted real thick where I need a 1 ounce jig, or they could be like pitching and flipping around scattered milfoil on the Potomac River, where you can pitch and flip it with a 1/4 ounce or a 3/8 ounce jig. But any type of a hard grass edge is really good with a jig all year long. Just a really good way to do it. The second type of areas I really like to look for a jig is boat docks. Boat docks and jigs go hand in hand, and you can catch bass on a lot of different type of lures around docks. You can catch them on Ned rigs, shaky heads, Texas rig, creature baits, but you're going to get your quality fish on a jig for sure. And when I'm fishing a jig on docks, I fish both the pitching and flipping jig and the finesse jig, depending upon how deep the water is around the dock, the water clarity around the dock, the type of cover is around the dock. Because, say for example, if we're fishing Lake of the Ozarks right now, you can go in the back of some of those coves and you can get boat docks that have just 2 or 3 feet of water on the outside edge of them that are dirty. And that's when I'll go to the full size finesse jig. And if I'm on a part of Lake of the Ozarks where you're fishing the main lake on the lower end of the lake where it's clear, I'll skip a finesse jig up underneath the walkways or something. But jigs are really good around docks. Lay downs is another thing. Anytime that you have some type of a lay down wood, it doesn't matter how that is positioned within the lake, it's going to be a really good jig water. A jig allows you to, effectively fish all different densities of a lay down, all different, depths of a lay down. Definitely will generate the bigger strikes. And my favorite thing to fish a jig in by far is any type of flooded cover. If you've got any type of flooded trees, flooded bushes, anything that's flooded like that, that is when jigs excel more than any other time of the year. We talked about willows, we talked about buckbrush. I mean, this can occur all year long depending upon the seasonal fluctuations in the water. But anytime the water is in newly flooded cover, the first thing I reach for is a jig. And I've got to let the bass tell me that they do not want a jig before I'll actually, switch to that. And lastly, the type of cover I look for a jig is bluffy banks. Bluff banks on the main lake, bluff banks in the river arms, bluff banks in the creeks. It doesn't matter if it's pre-spawn, summer, fall, winter. There's always a group of bass that are living on bluffy or really steep channel banks that drop off into deep water. And jigs are one of the top lures that you can use with that. Both the pitching and flipping jigs, I'll use those sometimes if there's any type of cover on those bluffs. But a lot of the times that's when I go to either the finesse flipping jig or just a straight finesse jig. And I'll give you guys a real good jig tip here. This is something that I was taught by my jig fishing mentor, a guy named Terry Thomas, like 40 years ago, is when you're fishing a jig on a rocky, bluffy bank, never pitch that jig up in front of the boat at a 45-degree angle. Pitch that jig straight into the bank and work it straight out of it. Because when you pitch a jig straight into the bank on a steep, bluffy bank, you can work that jig straight down the cover and you don't miss anything like that. Because Terry, all the time that I was fishing with him, every time I started to pitch up a little bit in front of the boat, he'd just say, reel it in and do not do that again. He said, we will get to those fish in a second. You need to fish for those fish that are right in front of you, straight into the bank right here. And that allows you to pick apart every foot of that bank on there. That's a big bluff, steep bank jig fishing tip that I learned from that. But anyway, that's what I look for: bluff banks, flooded cover, docks, grass, whatever shallow cover that's available, usually around some type of an object.
Awesome, good deal. Yeah, that's completely out of my wheelhouse there. Bunch of really good comments here. I'm going to try to address some of these comments here in a second, Randy. I do want to I want to address one comment here really quick, and also give you guys a perspective on a couple other lakes that are a little bit different from the ones I talked about earlier. I talked about those deep, clear lakes. I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the dirty water lakes. But two questions here from Dan. One question was on those subtle points that are back in these pockets and stuff, these subtle little points, do there need to be cover or regularities? Yes. I'm usually looking for some sort of change in rock composition, bigger rock to smaller rock, something like that. or there needs to be like a brush pile or something there. There needs to be some type of cover. That's what holds those fish there. If it's just a clean bottom, it's not going to be nearly as good. And then if you aren't getting big on the bottom composition changes in similar areas, how long do you fish before you eliminate that water? Jess, I'm basically just going to graph these spots, and I'm not going to fish any of them until I see fish on the spot. So that's how I do it, and I might have to graph 40 of these subtle points before I find one or two that's productive. But what you'll usually find is that the bass are going to be in a certain section of a creek. So if you find that the bass are on this subtle point, there's a really good chance that they're on another subtle point within like 100 to 200 yard area. You're not usually going to find a fish on a subtle point in the middle of a creek, and then one on a subtle point out here on the main lake, and then one way in the back of a creek. Usually when you're doing the offshore fishing with that football jig, they're going to be in a smaller 200, 300 yard section of a creek. That's where you're going to find them. So if I'm dealing with dirtier water, so Randy kind of talked about the shallow, flip and stuff like that, but if you have a lake where it's shallow and muddy and you still want to try to fish offshore with a jig, I actually go to, it's not necessarily a jig, I'm kind of cheating a little bit, but it's a swing head or a biffle bug style bait. This is actually literally a biffle bug with a biffle hard head. It's a swing head jig, and this is an absolutely killer bait in the fall on these dirtier, shallow water lakes. And a couple examples I'll give to you. Number one is Lake Dardanelle here over in Arkansas. This is a shallow, muddy lake. Definitely not going to be more than 2 foot of water visibility for most of the year. It's going to be 1.5 feet, maybe a foot of visibility. And when I'm dealing with a lake like Lake Dardanelle, the key areas that I'm really looking for, if we go over here on Google Earth, are areas where the fish can set up in 2 to 5 feet of water offshore on either some type of rock or some type of shell. Shell beds or rocks, that's the key things I'm looking for. I made a video, the last video actually on the Main Fish in the Moment YouTube channel about how to identify shell beds on your fish finder and how to find them. Check out that video if you want to learn more about shell beds. This also applies for fishing any sort of river system, Potomac River, Arkansas River, stained, muddy lakes that are shallow, even some of the lakes in like Louisiana that are shallow and muddy. And what I'm looking for is basically, as you get back in these creeks, guys, there's going to be small little areas, like maybe this flat right here, for example, that is going to have some shell. I know for a fact there's a shell bed that sets up right here that used to set up here like years and years ago, where I almost won a tournament in the fall, throwing a swing head on that shell bed in October, and I was throwing also a little crankbait up there, but a swing head jig on that shell bed, and there were shad all over it, and there were guys all over the banks beating the bank, and there was some shallow coontail grass and stuff, but those fish weren't all up in the grass. Some of them were out here off the shell bed, and that's where I caught those fish. And basically, I'm just looking on these massive flats, kind of back in these creeks, that have a little bit of deep water close by. There's another little rocky spot right here, for example, that I've caught some fish on as well, and it's usually you're going to find these spots where there's a little bit of a drop off from deeper water up to shallower water. It's not just going to be on the middle of just like a random big flat. But there are times when you can find them on those random big flats. And again, I find those fish with my electronics, or just, I explained it in that other YouTube video. Just go check out my main YouTube channel, and I'll explain how to find shell beds. It's the most recent video I made. The other type of thing I'm looking for, let's say you're on a clear water lake, for example, that is muddy up on the upper end. So like up on the upper end here, there's some more stain to the water. So maybe it's not like a river system lake, but it's like a lake, for example, like this, where on the lower end on Greers Ferry Lake, you have, need to change over here. On the lower end, you have 8 foot of visibility, but up here, up the river arms, you have a foot of visibility. And the areas I'm looking for are very similar, and I actually have an image here where the lake is drawn down, and I'll show you some of the areas I've caught them really well on a swing head. And it's going to be areas like this where you have like this little rock pile right here that's just off this flat that's not deep. It's only in a few feet of water. Here's another little rocky patch right here that I've caught some fish off of before in the fall. And then also here's another little rocky patch. And these are just like little rocky irregularities on flats. And I normally find these by just graphing with my electronics over these big flats. There's other stuff out here that's interesting, like this culvert and stuff that I'll fish a finesse jig around. But if we take the lake back up to normal pool, you can see that when it's normal, all this stuff is under the water. This is, all of these marks I made are under the water, but as the water falls out and it's lower at times, you'll find these irregularities, these rocky spots, these areas like this. And this is what I'm really keen on assuming there's enough water on them. There was one question earlier about what happens or how do you adjust when the lake is actually falling, when the water is falling out of this lake. And what I like to do personally is if a lake is falling pretty quickly, I try to go to the clearest section of the lake I can find and look for suspended fish. And I'll get Randy's opinion on this too. But when a lake is falling, especially like a foot and a half or a foot a day or over the course of a short period of time, I like to find the cleanest water possible and find those fish that are suspended over deeper structure, over deeper water. And in that clearer water, you can usually catch those fish on a swim bait, on a jerk bait, something along those lines. That always has worked better for me rather than trying to adjust to those fish that are constantly moving from one piece of cover to another up in shallower water. So my recommendation when the water falls is find the deepest, clearest water you can find and try to fish that. But that's what I do. Randy, what do you do up shallow when that lake is dropping hard in the fall?
Well, when this time of year when the lake's falling, the first thing I try to do is I try to go to isolated targets. I mean, it doesn't matter if you go back in a cove and there's one dock there, or if you go back in a cove and you see one little lay down in the middle of the cove. Isolated cover, bass will suck to that isolated cover as the water drops, as long as you have decent water depth around it. It doesn't have to be deep or doesn't have to have deep water right next to it, but it just needs to have at least 2 foot of water. But the biggest tip that I could give you guys jig fishing this time of year is just go out of your way to hit isolated targets. And one other thing I'm going to leave you guys with tonight on jig fishing is that one of the big things about jig fishing is it requires a shift in your mentality a little bit, because when you put a jig on versus like a worm or a beaver or something like that, you got to know that you're probably going to reduce the amount of bites that you get, and you're going to sacrifice those bites for an upsize in the average quality of the fish. So you need to make that mental shift once you put that jig in and tell yourself, yeah, I'm not going to get as many bites, but I'm going to get some better fish. I just got to stay with it and commit to it.
For sure. Definitely agree with that. And one more question here from Bill. He asks you, Randy, does the 94-degree days we're getting here in Kansas ever seem to delay what the bass should be doing? Does that warmer temperature delay the fall migration?
That's the thing, Bill. We're right across the border from you here. It's like summer right now. I think it does a little bit. I mean, I think that, bass, one of the big things that triggers their movement in the fall is water temperature drops. So if we're getting these record highs this time of year, it's definitely going to put them behind a little bit.
For sure. They are, it's way behind, but what you'll find is that we have had those colder nights, a few colder nights, and that will start those bass and baitfish moving because they feel that cold weather coming. One reason that the bass move back into the creeks is because the thermocline starts to disappear. I explained that in another live stream, a couple of live streams ago, and those bass don't wait until the thermocline has completely disappeared. So at the first sign of those major cold fronts, we've had a couple of nights here in like the 50s and the high 40s. That's going to start those bass moving. They may not move as far back as they would if it was colder, but they've already started their move. I've seen that on a lot of these lakes. They're moving into the mouths of the creeks, into the middle part of the creeks. Even some baitfish are in the backs of the creeks already on some lakes. So the move has started. It just maybe isn't as fast. Maybe they're going to be delayed like a week or two, but it's happening already, I would say. What do you think, Randy?
Yeah, absolutely. Totally agree.
Sure. Good deal. Awesome. Well, that is our advanced jig fishing. We talked a lot about baits, a little bit about areas. Hopefully that was okay for you guys. A couple things real quick, guys. If you want to enter into our Bridgeford beef jerky giveaway, just leave a comment down below after the video is posted in the actual comments of the video, letting us know what your favorite jig is, the brand and the type of jig that you like to fish. Leave it in the comments and you'll be entered in to win a case of Bridgeford beef jerky. Just come back to the stream next week and you'll be able to figure out if you won. Also, just a quick reminder to head over to thebasstank.com if you guys want to check out or you want to get any electronics installed into your boat, whether that's Live Scope or any other fish finders. They are the best in the industry at installing fish finders, so definitely check them out if you have any fish finder installation needs. Finally, head over to our website, fishthemoment.com, and check out some of our lake breakdowns. We have a ton of them coming up, guys. Every single week, Randy's making more of the fall lake breakdowns. We have a ton of them up here already, and I'm also knocking out some offshore lake breakdowns on lakes all across the country. I got 5 out recently. And basically, you get 30 GPS waypoints for the offshore ones or 40 GPS waypoints for the shallow water ones. We give you detailed area descriptions. We give you waypoints, how to install the waypoints. We give you detailed information on how to understand why we pick the areas, all kinds of things like that. So definitely check those out over on our website, fishthemoment.com. So Randy, that is it. Anything else you have for the viewers before we sign off?
Yeah, just appreciate you guys tuning in tonight, man. It's just, we got a lot of the same guys showing up every week looking here at the feed. We really appreciate that support. I mean, Jonny and I talk about it all the time. We don't take it for granted that you guys are taking time out of your evening to go check us out. And we just really appreciate you guys supporting what we do, because if it wasn't for you guys, we wouldn't be able to do this.
For sure. We always appreciate the support. Appreciate everyone commenting on the videos, watching every single week. If you guys like the content here, make sure to head over to our other YouTube channels. The main Fish the Moment channel, just Fish the Moment on YouTube, and also Randy's channel, Intuitive Angling with Randy Blockett. We post YouTube videos all the time. I've been not posting as many videos, but I have a video coming out this Friday, Randy, so we're going to be getting more content over on Fish the Moment. Just have a bunch of projects in the works that you guys are going to be very excited about, but I can't talk about yet. That's how it always goes with projects, Randy. You work so hard. I'm working on one of those projects for like 2 years, and I can't tell anyone about it. Yeah. And I'm working in the scenes, but that's how that stuff goes. So excited to share all that with you guys when that comes to fruition. But otherwise, tune in next week. We're going to do that analysis on bass fishing, professional bass fishing. What are the actual costs, the breakdowns? How well do you have to do to actually make it on tour? I think that'll be pretty interesting. Hopefully we don't make too many people mad, and hopefully we also don't get too much wrong, but we're going to try our best. That's all we can ask for. So definitely tune in next week if you guys are interested in that. And otherwise, enjoy the rest of your week and have a good night. Go Hogs.